Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Minh, and I'm your host from NDIS Property Australia. And you listen to this SDA Housing Podcast, the show explains, highlights, guides, and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today, we have a special guest speaker, Kirstie Shaw from Clyde in Melbourne. Kirstie, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. How the hell is the bloody Melbourne weather down there for you, eh?
Freezing.
Freezing.
It was a crisp 3 degrees today.
Damn. I've never experienced this cold of a winter ever in my life. And I'm in Brisbane too, by the way.
Oh.
Brisbane's normally a week or two of cold, but this has been like 3 months. I can't believe it. Yeah.
I know. My mum rings me from Brisbane all the time and tells me, it's so cold. And I'm like, let's not do this. Let's not play this game, Mum.
So where's Mum living?
She's in the western suburbs of Brisbane in a lovely little place called Pullenvale.
Ah, Pullenvale. That's very nice. Near a Moggle area. That's very nice.
Yeah, I used to live in Moggle as well. So
You're a busy girl.
I am, yes.
How'd you end up in Melbourne?
Oh, long story. Husband got a job.
You moved for him? Really?
Yes. Well, yeah, we decided to relocate the whole family.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. So, Kirstie, you gave me a nice introduction of who you were and your background, but it was just too long for me. I don't want to talk about. I'd rather you introduce yourself. So you go for it. Go.
Okay, so I am a disability support worker, which I've been doing for the last 6 years. And I am also a parent to 2 neurodivergent children. I'm also in a sort of support coordinator role too. And I am a qualified counsellor, and I'm studying my master's in disability and inclusion. And I love advocacy.
A jack of all trades.
Yeah, wear many hats.
And a master of what course again?
Disability and inclusion. So obviously I'm very passionate about disability, both from a personal and a professional perspective.
Well, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, just to clarify for the listeners of the show, what's our topic today on our podcast? Topic is?
So the topic is the gaps in the various areas of housing.
So the gaps in disability housing. That's the
yes.
title, yeah? Cool.
Yep.
How do we begin? You start.
So I had a situation with a person that I work with who was struggling to sort of maintain their housing options. And when I was doing some research around the options that were available to them, I sort of identified a lot of gaps between the NDIS and the state government and saw a lot of things that were going wrong.
And this is the person you and I were talking about 2 weeks ago, is that right?
That's right, yes. Let's call her Annabelle.
Annabelle, okay.
Annabelle, yep. So I've worked with Annabelle for the last 6 years, and basically she's had the opportunity to be able to sort of pay a flatmate to live with her, and the flatmate provides that sort of informal support. And the only way that we could sort of facilitate some of the rent being paid was because she's getting paid to do that informal support. She can be paid that through her ILO plan, which is the Independent Living Options plan. And I know you had somebody on talking about ILO, but I sort of realised that, again, there's a real lack of sort of choice and control when you get to a certain age and you don't necessarily want to share your home with somebody and you're kind of, forced into that situation. It really can be quite limiting for you.
Sure. So for a bit of context to our listeners, in the world of NDIS housing, we have the
yes.
homes, group homes, SDA homes, cell homes, and ILO. Now, ILO is a very new part of the housing world in the NDIS. It's
yes.
called ILO. It's now being called ILA.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
You want to bring it back and give us a very dumbed down version of why is there an ILO concept in the NDIS housing world, please?
So it's supposed to be a flexible model where the person can live alone with a flatmate or in a co-designed arrangement. Support is funded based on need, but housing itself is not funded. So things like rent are not covered. It's really only a viable option if the person can afford rent or access private housing. It's ideal in its principle, but it fails without the proper rental subsidies or access to safe housing. So we sort of found that Annabelle was in a situation where full rental amount was costing her over 66% of her income. And the only viable option for her was to share with a flatmate. But, you know, we've had some wonderful flatmates and we've had some not so great ones. And it's been a bit of a difficult road for all of us.
So would it be fair for me to surmise that the ILO concept model is a way for participants to live independently away from those group homes scenarios? Is that right?
Yeah. So when we're sort of talking about group homes, I guess the terminology used most often is SIL, which is supported independent living. It's usually shared housing with sometimes 24/7 paid support, which is funded by the NDIS, but only the support is funded. It is usually delivered in group homes managed by a single provider, and often they control both the tenancy and the support team. Residents are often placed with people that they didn't choose and sometimes have little say over routines or who enters the home. The critical concerns around that model is that sometimes staff are imposed by the provider, even if the participant does have an existing trusted team. Support is often bundled with housing, so if the participant wishes to change providers, they do risk eviction. And the concerns around the model is that, you know, some SIL providers have pressured participants or families to change support teams. There was a recent report done by the Disability Advocacy Network Australia and the National Centre for Disability Advocacy, which was quite concerning and showed that sometimes providers were initiating guardianship proceedings to gain control over finances, medical decisions or daily life, which results in a total loss of autonomy where the provider can control housing support and legal authority. And, you know, we find that even though it was never intended to be this way, the supported independent living situations sometimes can mirror the institutional power dynamics in a community setting, which breaches both NDIS principles and human rights obligations.
On that guardianship topic, you know, in Queensland here we call it Office of Public Guardian, OPG.
Yep.
Down there you call it OP something, OPA or something?
Yeah, something like that.
So wouldn't they be the guardianship person?
Well,
in theory?
In theory, but what the report sort of identified is that more often than not, if they're not going on to public guardianship, providers are actually nominating themselves as guardians, which is just such a conflict of interest and such an ethical and moral minefield. Really shocked me when I read that. I was like, what? How is that even a thing?
Does this happen a lot out there?
Well, the report actually was Australia-wide and it did specify the different problems that they were seeing in the different states. But overall, the message is that, you know, it seems to be that either the providers are becoming the guardians or they are referring to the Office of Public Guardianship. And look, that's a whole nother podcast episode on the problems with that.
Remind me in 2 months' time to do that top podcast.
Sure, we can do that. No problem. Yeah.
So back to the gaps in NDIS housing. So what topics? I mean, I want to bring some topics up as well myself, but what topics do you want to cover on this episode?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to note that an overarching theme that I've seen in the disability world is that as soon as you say the word disability, the first thing that comes to people's minds is NDIS. And look, to be fair to the NDIS, housing is actually a state government responsibility. It's not a federal government responsibility. So I think, you know, advocacy and policy change actually needs to come from state government level.
And on that very point, we're in the news the last 6 months or more, the federal government, being the NDIA, are trying to push back the responsibility back to the states on the topic of foundational support.
Foundational supports, yep.
So what is this foundational supports thing, please, Kirstie?
So my understanding of foundational supports is that basically back in the day before the NDIS, I know in Queensland in particular, because I access this funding for my son, there was funding through the state government called FAXIA, and it enabled us to access early intervention supports for my child. And so now I think the NDIS have perhaps underestimated the amount of children that would require that foundational support and early intervention stuff. And so now they're kind of thinking they might want to give it back to the states so that it can become a state scheme where they offer that early intervention stuff with, children, particularly through the maternal and child health care, nurses and those sorts of really amazing community services. So they want to put it back into the communities, because I think that's also really important.
Yep, totally agree. I'll ask you more questions about this topic, but I don't want to go off track here. Back to the gaps in housing. So,
yes,
silly question from me on behalf of the listeners. Why are we even talking about gaps in housing? Why is this so important to you to express your firm beliefs as to the issues to be identified and how we think could be rectified here? Please go away.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the research that I've done, I've realised that the NDIS, if we go to specialist disability accommodation, so SDA, now I don't think a lot of people are aware of this, but it's only a very small percentage of NDIS participants that are even eligible for that level of housing support. So it's less than 6% of the total NDIS.
I know the number. It's about 3%.
There you go. So there you go.
It was forecast at 6%, but the reality is 3%.
3%. So it's a very small portion of the market, and it's a very niche and specialist area, as it should be, because those, people who are looking and eligible for SDA housing have very specific individual needs, and that needs to be considered when looking at housing options for them. But it only funds the building. It doesn't fund the supports. And it's often shared, location limited, and as I said, very available to a small percentage of participants. The problem is the gap. So basically the NDIS will not fund rent. End of discussion. The rental subsidy that is paid by the federal government for people who are on the disability pension is not a lot. It's quite a small amount. And when you're talking about private rentals, we know the rental market has exploded. Housing costs are high. Rental costs are high. I mean, I've seen the market in Brisbane. When we left, we were renting a lovely home for about $450 a week. That home recently got rented for $700 a week. So that is a huge increase in the rental cost. Also, what we've sort of seen is that the only other option for people with disability is public housing or community housing. So public housing is obviously managed by the DFFH, but the wait lists are often over 10 years and there's very limited accessible stock. And the system does not consistently prioritise people with disability, especially those not at immediate risk of homelessness. And the other thing that we've seen is, even though we know that this model doesn't work, the government tends to favour high density housing situations where we're seeing, buildings full of people who have very different circumstances in their life. And, we see people with disabilities often housed in very unsafe situations with people who can exhibit extreme, we'll call them behaviours of concern, I guess, and it can be very detrimental for people with disabilities to be living in those situations, particularly people with psychosocial disabilities and, a lot of issues around that. Now, the other thing is the community housing is the other option. They do say that they do prioritise people with disabilities. Sometimes the wait list can be still up to 3 years minimum. That's absolute minimum. Community housing is managed for not-for-profit housing organisations or mission-based providers, and it's usually linked to disability or mental health supports. And some providers mandate in-house support workers, which denies the person the right to choose their own team. Some of them pressure tenants to change services or link housing to specific providers. We've heard of some severe cases where providers have threatened eviction if the person resists the imposed support. And we've also seen the issues of guardianship as well, which has happened. Community housing can replicate group home power dynamics when housing support and decision-making authority are concentrated in one provider. So again, it's not an ideal option. There's a lot of systemic problems that come from that. So the problem that I've seen is that in this particular situation with Annabelle, she is in a very stable private rental agreement. She's been there for 7 years. She's about, next year when she renews her lease, it'll be 8 years. She's got beautiful neighbours. She's very ingratiated into the community. She's a valued contributing member of the community. And we figured out that in order for her rent to be subsidised, the recommended level of 70%, because obviously the ideal period of rent to income is 30% on the livability scale, it would cost the government $20,000, which, is a very small amount when you're looking at the levels of funding, given to people for support. It's $20,000 for her to stay in her home that she's already established in, where she's a part of the community and where she has that informal support around her of her beautiful neighbours. And, we looked at the options that were available. It would cost the government a lot more to have her in public housing, because obviously in public housing, they're responsible for the upkeep and maintenance and repairs, whereas she's currently in a private rental. Those responsibilities fall onto her landlord. And then when we go into the SIL and SDA models, it costs upwards of 6 figures for the NDIS. Even if they're not funding rent, it's still going to cost them more to have her upended and put into those situations. So from a cost perspective, doesn't it make sense to perhaps subsidise and bridge the gap to keep people in their established situations?
Yeah,
and that's just what didn't make sense to me. My brain was like, not computing. How is this not a thing?
When I had that podcast a year and a half ago with Dr. Aviva from IRA, a ILO session, I think at that time I counted about only 1,000-ish people in the ILO system. And she predicted that in the long term will be more of a larger increase, which makes sense because it saves money to the NDIS, give more independent living. Nobody wants to be living in a group home anyway. So if there's another option, another feasible option financially for the government and the participant to live in a more of a independent lifestyle with supports around them, then that should be the way to go forward. Yes, I totally agree.
Well, I kind of think, okay, we've got a shortage of housing, but we do have availability in the private rental market. So why would the government not look at ways of providing more subsidies for people with disability to get into the private rental market? They're already partnering in the community housing space. I don't understand why we wouldn't want to be working with landlords and real estate agents, because obviously I know quite a few people in that space and they absolutely love the concept of what we're doing. And I guess the other thing, I was a little bit naive going into the work that I do. I've been very, very lucky to work with families who have a very strong and clear vision of what they want for their person with a disability. And that person with a disability also has a very clear vision of what they want for their life. And, I didn't realize how sort of rare that is until I started working in this space and meeting people that were not in those situations. And as we're seeing like a real change in our shift of thinking around disability, and we're seeing more of a human rights-based approach and more of moving from, that sort of medical-based deficit model to that social model of disability, the change is coming. It's slow, but it's happening. And my vision is to see everybody in situations like my client, beautiful Annabelle, because, hers shouldn't be the gold standard. Hers should just be the standard. It should be the accepted standard.
I totally agree. And I think with time, and advocates like yourself and other people like the Summer Foundation, who has recently put out a paper on ILA.
Yes. Yep.
That will have more push into the government and the NDIS to have some small changes there. So it's a battle. Everything in the NDIS is a big battle. So uphill battle. But in time, we hope that these small changes can occur because it will make everyone's life more happier, both as the participants and also the NDIS system as well.
Yeah. I agree. And I also think that, when we sort of, I guess, identify people's individual needs, there can be a lot of, there's a lot of negative rhetoric in the media around the NDIS and participants and money wastage. But at the end of the day, if people actually had the person-centered individualized support that they needed, we would actually be saving money because we'll be supporting people to live their best life, supporting them in employment, which means they're paying tax, they're contributing to society, they're valued members of their team, they're able to work because they're getting the right support that they need. And, it just has this real flow-on effect. And I think, when we try to put people into boxes and apply a level of funding for each person, regardless if they've got a specific diagnosis, that's actually not fair either because some people do require less support and some people require more. So I guess, my soapbox is always about that individualized person-centered support model. And I think that, the government is desperately trying to rein in costs because they madly underestimated the amount of people who were eligible for the scheme. And that's their own fault. I'm going to be a little bit of a cow there and say that. That's your own fault because you had the statistics and you chose to cherry pick the numbers. And now you're desperately scrambling to try and save face. And now it's become a political game. And that really irritates me because the fact of the matter is that it's not an easy thing to get NDIS. I think people think that, I'm just going to wake up one day and get a diagnosis and get NDIS. Trust me, it is not that simple. And, we're talking about very burnt out families who are desperately trying to seek the help that they need and access the scheme so that they can, help their person with a disability live their best life. And the whole process, people just give up before they even get to the finish line because it's just too hard.
Yep, they do.
Yep.
What other gaps do you see in the housing market there? And by the way, I think in time when the group homes are phased out, because there's a period of 10 years from when the NDIS started in its jurisdiction.
Yeah.
In theory, group homes have to be phased out at some point. I think when they are moving towards that end date of the group homes, you will see more ILA activity in the marketplace around Australia.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that's our hope. But again, ILA only deals with the supports within the home. It doesn't cover the rent. It doesn't cover, actual housing. And the other problem that I see with this model is that I met a young girl recently at the Valid Advocacy Conference that I was lucky enough to attend. And she was highly concerned because she was faced with a really difficult choice. She was absolutely desperate to leave home and live, independently. Her only viable option for her particular situation because of her level of support required was the SIL model. But she was very distressed because the SIL provider, and this is common for a lot of people, they take up to 90% of someone's disability pension to cover the rent. So even though they're in SIL accommodation, they are still paying those private rental rates.
Are you sure 90% of their pension? Because I heard that there was a limit to what they can take, as in 145, 170 a week. That's what I was understood to be.
Well, that's not knowledge that I have. I'm not
unless that covers
to be an oracle about all of this, and it's just what I found in my findings. But it is, from what I understand and the research that I've done, it is very common for providers to take up to 90% of someone's pension to cover the rent.
I want to question this. Up to the word up to is key. Up to could be anything up to 60, 70, 80, true. But also covers the food and the utilities as well. So not just the rent, it's all the costs of living in the house. Yeah.
But if you look at the amount left over for them to live on, I find it very interesting because when I first started working in the industry about 5 years ago, there was a specific thing that if a participant had psychosocial disabilities and one of their goals was, social and community connection, the NDIS was funding those activities. And now with the recent changes that occurred in October and then April this year, the NDIS has said they will not be funding those activities. And what we've found that has happened is that funding that the NDIS used to say they would do, they'll say, yeah, we'll fund an activity, but we're going to force you to go to a disability segregated setting. That's the only way we'll fund it, because if it's not disability related, we're not going to fund it. And so we've seen this real shift within the NDIS from that integrated mainstream accessing open situations like, say, an art class. If you want to go to an art class, you can't just go down to the art class at your local community house and pay that $20. You now have to go to a specific disability-run class. It has to be related to disability. And the problem with that is we're seeing people with disability being segregated into those settings again, which is a real step backwards.
It is, yes. We're approaching the end of our episode here. What other topics or matters on the gaps in housing do you want to cover before we finish off?
Yeah, so obviously I just wanted to reiterate the main points that I sort of found in my research, which is that people with disability do frequently pay, I think the statistic quoted was between 60 and 90% of their disability pension on rent. The recommended affordability benchmark is 30% of income. So this discrepancy can push many people into chronic financial crisis, where they have to make a call between their independence and potentially moving back home and relying on family to provide a lot of care. I think the NDIS relies a lot on unpaid carers, which is a whole nother topic that I would love to discuss. Unpaid labour, usually done by women. So that's another issue that we can talk about. Access to safe and private rentals are rare and very overpriced. And without a rent subsidy or a housing guarantee, like we say, many are forced into SIL, which is basically the rebranded group home situation, or often, we see people forced into homelessness or crisis accommodation, which is, not what we want. So I'm sort of going to be asking the people that I can get hold of, why would the state government not want to assist somebody with a disability to get into a private, stable rental agreement with understanding landlords and rental property agents, and just, subsidise the gap between affordability and the private rental? Would alleviate so much stress on the public housing sector and also save a lot of costs for the government in the long run.
Well, that's very, how do I say this? Good in theory, and we can only hope and pray that all the advocates in the NDIS world can come together and pool their energies to try and bring awareness to the NDIS, the NDIA.
Look, there's some amazing advocacy bodies working in this space to address a lot of the overarching problems within the disability sector, and their voices are really loud and clear and amazing. But I think there's a lot of background noise where they're just not being heard at the moment. And, I think it's great to see the Disability Advocacy Network of Australia as a place where a lot of voices can get together and tackle issues together in a united front. And I know that, this is something that they've questioned as well.
So, Kirstie, if anyone who's listening wants to get more involved in disability advocacy, what's the best advice for you to them to move forward, to discover, find, join, or collaborate with? Where would they go to get involved there?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say about advocacy is that, curiosity and collaboration is probably the most important part of the space, because when we alienate people, our messages don't get through. So sometimes we have to sort of calm that inner fire and work from that place of curiosity and collaboration and working to make things better. I think your best bet is to go to a national or state disability advocacy organisation. You could start volunteering there. You could start getting connected with advocates in your area. There's lots of opportunities for you to be a good advocate and ally. And the other thing is, the most important voices are not ours, but the people with disability They are the experts in their lives, in their experiences. And it's very important that we don't drown out their voices, but we help to support and amplify their voices.
Wonderful words. Kirstie, thank you so much for wonderful words of advice. We look forward to bringing you back in the future to talk about one of the other favourite topics in the disability world. And good luck, goodbye, and see you soon.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on. It was such a wonderful opportunity to talk about something that I'm so very passionate about. So thanks for giving me a voice today.
Anytime, Kirstie. Bye-bye. See you later.
See ya.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.